On my 68th birthday, my son handed me a suitcase. The house was quiet, so quiet I could hear the clink of my wedding band as it slid along the handle. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with that look, that hollow, strained patience people wear when they've decided something for you, and they're waiting for you to comply. There was a car running in the driveway. I could hear its low hum through the open front door. I think that was the part that hurt most. How ready everything was, as if they'd rehearsed this, as if I wasn't meant to be surprised. I'm Evelyn Carson. I'm 68, and that was the moment I knew my place in this family had been quietly erased long before I saw the suitcase. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. The suitcase was old, my husband's, from the days when business trips took him from hotel to hotel. I'd kept it clean all these years, stored in the hall closet behind a row of winter coats no one wore anymore. I suppose it made sense for them to use it. It was familiar, and I had packed it too many times for his journeys. I knew the creak of its zipper, the worn leather handle, the faint smell of cedar from the sachets I used to keep inside. I looked at it sitting there on the tiled floor by the stairs, and I thought, this is it. This is how it ends, with a suitcase I once packed for love, now packed to send me away. We were in the house I had lived in for 42 years, the house where I had planted hydrangeas along the fence, where I had painted the kitchen yellow because I wanted the mornings to feel warm, even on the grayest days. The house where I had stood, once, with a baby on my hip and another tugging at my skirt, thinking, this is what it means to be needed, that the hydrangeas are gone now. The fence had been replaced with something taller, colder. The kitchen was no longer yellow. They'd painted it gray during a remodel I hadn't wanted but agreed to because they said it would help sell the house one day. It wasn't my house anymore, not really. I had become a guest in the place I had built. My son Adam was 45 then. He had his father's broad shoulders, but his eyes were mine, or they had been. The last time I recognized myself in them was maybe a decade ago, before he started looking at me the way people look at something they don't quite know what to do with, like a piece of furniture that doesn't fit the room anymore. I remember standing there, staring at that suitcase, and thinking, I did this. I raised him to be practical, decisive. I taught him to plan, to take care of things, and here he is, taking care of me. There was no fight, no scene. I didn't ask where I was going, because I already knew. A residence, they called it. A place where people like me, people who had become inconvenient, were sent to be looked after by strangers. A place with clean halls and cheerful staff, and rooms that smelled faintly of antiseptic and loss. I picked up the suitcase. It felt heavier than it should have. Not because of what was inside, I doubted they had packed much, but because of what it meant. I didn't look back at Adam. I didn't want to see that expression again, the one that said, this is for the best. I stepped out onto the porch, the wooden boards warm under my feet from the afternoon sun. The car, my daughter-in-law's, waited at the curb, engine idling, radio low. I could hear the faint sound of it, talk show hosts laughing, birds were singing somewhere, and the roses I had planted years ago bloomed wild and unpruned along the side of the house. I thought of my husband then, Tom, gone 6 years now. I wondered if this would have happened if he were still here. I doubted it. He would have stood up for me. He would have reminded them what family meant. Or maybe I'm fooling myself. Maybe we had both been blind to how the world shifts under your feet when you're no longer essential. The drive was quiet. I watched the town pass by, the grocery store where I had shopped every Tuesday morning, the library where I'd taken Adam for story hour, the park where we had picnicked on Sundays. Places that had once been woven into the fabric of my life, now just scenery through a window. My daughter-in-law glanced at me in the rearview mirror a few times. Her face was tight, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't help her. There was nothing left to say. The residence was everything they said it would be. Clean, modern, friendly, the kind of place that tried very hard to feel like home but didn't. My room had a view of a small garden, and there was a recliner by the window, a television mounted on the wall, a dresser, a bed. It was fine. It was enough. They stayed just long enough to meet the manager, to make sure I was settled. Then there were hugs, stiff, polite, and promises to visit soon. I didn't believe them. I watched them walk back to the car, watching as the car disappeared down the long drive. Then I sat in the recliner and looked out at the garden, and I let the silence wrap around me. That was the moment they let me go, and I let them. The days that followed felt like walking through water. Everything is slower, heavier, muted. The room I was given had white walls, a pale blue bedspread, and a single painting of a field of lavender that looked like it had been chosen for its lack of offense. It was meant to soothe, I suppose, but it made me feel lonelier somehow. I'd sit by the window in the mornings, watching the gardeners in their green uniforms tend the small patch of roses and trimmed hedges. They worked with quiet precision, their faces kind but distant if our eyes met. I wondered if they could tell, if they could see the weight I carried. The weight I had carried for so long. I began to think of all the years that had led to that suitcase at my feet, all the small choices that, together, wove the life I thought I had, and the family I thought I knew. I thought of Adam as a boy, his small hand in mine, his cheeks flushed from running through the yard. I thought of the nights I stayed awake with him, through croup, through fevers, through nightmares I would chase away with lullabies and cool clothes. I thought of the birthdays I made, the pirate party when he turned 5, the space theme at 8, the quiet family dinner at 16 because that's what he wanted that year. Every cake made from scratch, every gift chosen with care. I never forgot a single one. And not just for him, for Tom, and for his parents, when they were alive. And later, for Adam's children and my grandchildren, who used to run to me, with their drawings, their sticky fingers, and their open arms. I made holidays warm, even when money was tight. I made Sunday dinners, even when I was tired. I kept the house running, kept the schedules straight, kept my worries quiet so they wouldn't have to carry them. When Tom lost his job that year in '92, I took on sewing work, hemming dresses, fixing jackets, making curtains for the neighbors. I never let Adam see how close we came to losing the house. I shielded him from that. Everything is hard. I was the one who sat by my mother-in-law's bed those final weeks, who bathed her, fed her, listened to her memories when she was too weak to speak above a whisper. Adam visited, yes, but always briefly. He was busy, he had work, he had a life. I understood. I always understood. When Tom had his stroke, I was there every therapy session, every appointment. I learned how to help him dress, how to help him eat when his hands shook. I kept him home as long as I could because he hated hospitals, hated the idea of being anywhere but with me. I did that, and I did it gladly. Because that's what love looks like when the years have worn away the shine, and left behind the truth of what a life together means. I remember the winter Adam got the flu, badly, his first year of college. He called, sounding so small on the phone. I drove for hours through snow and ice to bring him home, to make him soup, to sit by his bed like I had when he was little. He never asked me to, but he didn't have to. I knew, I always knew. And the little things, the invisible things that no one writes down, or thanks you for. The notes and lunchboxes, the clean laundry folded just the way they liked it. The phone calls I made to remind him about his grandfather's birthday, his cousin's graduation, the quiet forgiveness when he forgot mine. I don't say these things to make myself out as some kind of saint. I wasn't. I had my faults, my temper at times, my moments of impatience, of exhaustion, but I loved it. I loved every small act, and I thought that was enough. I thought love, given freely, would find its way back, but it doesn't always. Sometimes it drains out of you, drop by drop, unnoticed, until one day you realize you are empty. That's what I thought about as I sat by that window, watching the gardeners tend their perfect hedges. All the things I did for them, all the pieces of myself I gave away, without keeping enough to stay whole. There were nights I lay awake in that room, listening to the quiet hum of the building, and remembered the nights I had stayed up waiting for Adam to come home, the times I had paced by the window when he was late, imagining every terrible thing that could have happened, the times I smoothed his hair back from his forehead when he was sick or sad or scared, the times I watched him walk away from me to school, to college, down the aisle at his wedding, feeling that tug of pride and sorrow only a mother knows. And I thought of the choices, the times I said no to things I wanted so I could say yes to them, the painting class I never took because we needed the money for braces, the trip to Italy I dreamed of but postponed again and again because there was always a need greater than my own, the job offer I turned down so I could be home after school, all those quiet decisions that felt right at the time. And maybe they were. But now, sitting there, I wondered what they had added up to. What I had been building all those years, and for whom that I remembered Christmas Eve when Adam was 10, and the pipes burst in the kitchen. Tom was working late at the store, and I stayed up all night mopping, trying to keep the water from ruining the floors, wrapping towels around the leak, waiting for morning when we could call a plumber. Adam never knew. He came downstairs to a warm, dry kitchen, presents under the tree, cocoa on the stove. He smiled at me with that toothless grin, and it felt worth it. It always felt worth it. But is it worth it to whom? That was the question that echoed now, because here I was, in a room that wasn't mine, in a place I hadn't chosen, with a suitcase I hadn't packed, and all those things I did were invisible now, erased, like chalk from a board. Still, I held on to them. Because they were mine, because they were the truth of who I had been, and maybe still was, under the weight of all that had happened. I held on to the memory of the little hand in mine, the whispered goodnights, the sound of laughter in the yard. I held on to the taste of those Sunday dinners, the warmth of a sleeping child on my shoulder, the quiet moments of shared joy that no one could take from me. And as I sat there, in the pale light of that room, I realized something. All those things I did weren't for thanks. They weren't for repayment. They were for love. And love, real love, asks for nothing back. But it does notice, eventually, when it is not returned. That was the thought that carried me into the next morning, and the next. The quiet, steady knowing that love given freely is beautiful. But love taken for granted leaves a mark, even if no one else can see it. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part I think people don't understand. It wasn't as if one day they loved me, and the next they didn't. It was slower than that, so slow I barely noticed it first. Like a crack in a teacup that seems harmless, just a thin line beneath the glaze, until one day the cup shatters. In your hand, that's what it felt like. 100 small cracks, 100 quiet hurts that built upon each other, until all that was left was the breaking. I used to get a phone call every Sunday evening. Adam would call after dinner, sometimes with his children chiming in from the background, sometimes just him, his voice warm and familiar. I lived for those calls in the years after Tom passed. They gave shape to my week, something to look forward to, a sign that I still mattered. But then the calls became less regular. First it was a work trip, then a cold he didn't want to share, then simply, "We'll talk next week, Mom." I told myself it was fine, that he was busy, that he'd call when he could. But the weeks stretched longer, and my phone stayed silent on Sundays. There were birthdays forgotten, not mine, not at first, but the small ones, the ones that meant the most because they showed he remembered not just the date, but me. The flowers he used to send on the anniversary of my wedding to Tom stopped. The card on Mother's Day became a quick email. I kept them all, even the emails, printed out and folded into a box I stored in my dresser. I don't know why. Maybe because even the smallest effort felt precious by then. And the visits, those dwindled too. It used to be that Adam and his family would come by at least once a month. The house would fill with laughter, with the sound of children's feet running down the hall, with the smell of coffee and cookies. But then, the visits became shorter. They'd stay for lunch but not dinner. Then it was just a quick stop on their way somewhere else. Eventually, they stopped altogether, except for holidays. Even those felt more like obligations than celebrations. I remember one Thanksgiving, when I had set the table, polished the silver, made all the dishes that were their favorites. I waited, watching the clock, listening for the sound of their car, in the driveway. When they finally arrived, they stayed less than an hour. Said they had another dinner to get to. I packed up leftovers for them, smiled, waved as they left. And then I sat alone at that table, the candles still burning low, and felt the weight of their absence more than I ever felt the joy of their presence that day. It wasn't just Adam. My grandchildren, who used to run to me with open arms, began to pull away. They grew older, of course, as children do. But there was something else. A distance taught, perhaps, or maybe just the natural course of things when the adults in their lives modeled disinterest. I don't blame them. How could I? But it hurt all the same. There were other small betrayals, the kind that don't seem like much on their own. The time I wasn't told about a school play until the night before, when there was no way I could arrange a ride. The time they took a family vacation, and I learned about it from a photo on social media. The time Adam mentioned, offhand, that they were selling the cabin Tom and I had loved, the one we dreamed of retiring to, without so much as asking if I wanted to see it one last time. And then there was the house, my house, the one I had poured my life into. I remember the day Adam suggested it might be time to downsize. He said it so gently, as if it were for my benefit. Said it would be easier for me, that I didn't need so much space. I nodded, because that's what I had learned to do. But inside, I felt something give way. That house was my memory, my history, my anchor, and slowly, I realized, it was no longer mine in their eyes. It was a burden, something to be managed, something they would decide about, not me. There was the afternoon I fell. Just a small fall, nothing serious, but I called Adam because I was shaken. He didn't answer, didn't call back until the next day. I told him I was fine, of course, I always told him I was fine. But I sat in that quiet house that night, feeling the bruise darken on my hip, and thought about how alone I truly was. There were holidays where I found myself at the edge of the room, watching them all talk and laugh, feeling like a guest at my own table. Times when my voice felt small, my stories unwelcome, my presence tolerated rather than cherished. They didn't mean to be unkind, I know that, but unkindness doesn't always come from intention. Sometimes it comes from neglect, from the slow turning away of hearts that once beat in rhythm with your own. And through it all, I kept giving, keep offering help, gifts, time, and love, hoping, perhaps, that the giving would bridge the growing gap. But love isn't a rope you can use to pull someone back to you. Love is only ever a gift. And mine were being left unopened, unacknowledged, forgotten on the doorstep. I thought of all this, sitting in that room at the residence, watching the world go on outside my window. The staff were kind, in the way people are when they don't know you. They called me dear and hun, brought me my meals, and asked if I needed anything. But I needed something no one there could give. I needed to feel seen again. I needed to feel like I mattered. And that, I realized, was the quietest hurt of all, the sense that I had become invisible to the very people I had once been everything to. I began to see that the suitcase wasn't the beginning of my letting go, it was the end of theirs. The final act in a play that had been going on for years, scene after scene of small departures, small silences, small slights, until one day, there was no one left on stage but me. And so I sat, day after day, remembering, counting those quiet hurts, not to feed bitterness, but to understand, to see clearly, at last, the shape of what had happened. And in that seeing, to begin, perhaps, the slow work of healing. There is always a moment when the quiet hurts stop being quiet, when the small slights that you've absorbed, the ones you've explained away and forgiven without a word, gather together and form something solid, something that can no longer be ignored. I didn't see it coming, or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to admit it to myself. But there was a day, a single afternoon, when the last thread was cut, and whatever remained between us fell apart for good. It was late autumn, the kind of day where the sun sits low in the sky and casts everything in gold. I remember the way the light came through the trees outside the residence, the way it caught the last of the leaves clinging to the branches. I was sitting by the window, my usual place, when the knock came at my door. A man in a suit, polite, professional, carrying a slim briefcase. He introduced himself as a lawyer, hired by Adam. He said, I didn't understand at first. I thought perhaps it was about paperwork, maybe something to do with the house. I invited him in, offered him tea I didn't have. Old habits die hard. He explained, in the careful, measured tone of someone used to delivering unwelcome news, that Adam had asked him to handle some necessary legal matters on my behalf. That phrase, on my behalf, caught in my throat. He slid a folder across the small table between us. I opened it, my hands trembling just slightly. Inside were forms, neatly typed, with blank spaces for my signature. I scanned the words. My house, the house I had lived in for most of my life, was being sold. Not just discussed, not considered, but sold. The papers had already been prepared. All that was missing was my consent, my signature. I sat back in my chair, the weight of what I was seeing pressing down on me. I asked quietly, because that was how I spoke by then, why this was happening. The lawyer told me, still in that even, practiced voice, that it was for my benefit, that maintaining the house was too much for me, that Adam wanted to ensure I was comfortable, that my needs were met, that the proceeds from the sale would go into a trust for my care. But I knew the truth the way a mother always knows. I saw it in the small details. The papers had been prepared long before I was told. Decisions had been made without me. My voice, my wishes, weren't part of this. I was being handled, managed, moved aside like a piece on a chessboard, for my benefit, always for my benefit. I didn't sign that day. The lawyer left the papers with me and said I could take my time. But I knew that taking time wouldn't change anything. The decision had already been made. I was just expected to agree, to fall in line, as I had so many times before. I spent that night sitting by the window, watching as the sky darkened, as the streetlights flickered on one by one. I thought of that house. I could see it so clearly in my mind, the worn wood floors, the kitchen with its chipped tile, the living room where Tom and I had danced, just once, on a night when the radio played our song and the children were asleep, the garden out back where I had planted roses the year we bought the place, where Adam had played with his dog, where I had buried the little box of notes Tom wrote me over the years when he passed. That house wasn't just walls and a roof, it was my life. And now, it was being taken from me, wrapped up in legal language, and handed over as if it no longer mattered, as if I no longer mattered. The next morning, I called Adam. My hands shook as I dialed, and my voice felt small in my throat. He answered, sounded rushed. I told him about the papers. There was a pause, a long one, and then he said it was for the best, that he was trying to take care of me, that I didn't need to worry about these things anymore. And then, as if to soften the blow, he told me I should think of it as a fresh start. That phrase, fresh start, echoed in my mind long after the call ended. Fresh start for whom, I wondered. Certainly not for me. That was the final line. The moment I understood, in a way I hadn't wanted to see before, that I was no longer a person in their eyes. I was responsible, a task to be managed. The woman who had once been the center of their world had become a detail on a to-do list. In the days that followed, I sat with those papers, reading them over and over, as if understanding every word might change their meaning. I thought about the nights I'd spent awake with Adam as a baby, the meals I'd cooked, the birthday candles I'd lit, the sacrifices I'd made without a second thought. I thought of Tom, of how we'd built that home together, how we'd planned to grow old there. And I thought of how easily it was all being undone. I didn't cry. The tears had long since dried up. There comes a point when the well runs empty. Instead, I felt a kind of hollow quiet, a stillness that settled over me like a heavy blanket. I wasn't angry, not then. Just tired of giving pieces of myself away to people who no longer saw the worth in them. I made a decision, sitting there in that quiet room with the papers spread out before me, a decision that would change everything, though no one else knew it yet. I would not fight. I would not argue or plead. I would go silent. I would gather what strength I had left and begin to think, for the first time in a long time, about what I needed, about what was best for me, because if they could decide my life without me, then I could choose how to respond without them. The papers stayed on the table for another week, untouched. Every day, the staff would come in to check on me, to bring my meals, to ask if I needed anything. And every day, I would thank them and say no. What I needed, no one there could give me. What I needed was a way forward that belonged to me. Sun kept setting outside that window, casting long shadows across the floor. The leaves kept falling, the trees growing barren with each passing day. And I kept sitting, watching, waiting for the right moment. The moment when my silence would become my strength, when I would stop hoping to be seen and start seeing myself again. There is a particular kind of silence that isn't empty. It hums, like the space between thunder and rain. It waits. After that final line was crossed, after the papers were left on my table, and the weight of what they meant settled over me, I stepped into that silence, not out of anger, not out of spite, simply because I had nothing left to say. I had spoken, in so many ways, for so many years, in words, in deeds, in sacrifices. No one noticed, and none of it had mattered in the end. So I went quiet. I let the silence speak for me. The first thing I did was stop calling. I stopped trying to fill the gaps with my voice. Stopped leaving messages that went unanswered or returned too late to matter. When Adam didn't hear from me, I imagined he assumed I was content, that I was fine, that his plan was working, that I was being looked after. I let him think that. I let them all think that. It was easier than trying to explain what they no longer had ears to hear. The papers stayed where they were, untouched on the little table by the window. Every morning, I would sit with my tea, looking at them, tracing the shape of the signatures already scrawled across the bottom. I could see Adam's hand in the firm, confident line of his name, a son taking charge, doing what he thought best. For me, always for me. The irony was almost too much to bear. I learned the words of those documents by heart, as if memorizing them could somehow lessen their power. But I didn't sign. I wouldn't. Instead, I began to save, small amounts at first. From the modest allowance I received for my personal expenses, the residence provided everything I needed: meals, care, the basics. But there were little bits left over, and I tucked them away. Coins in a jar at first, then folded bills hidden in the lining of my purse, then in an old tin box I kept at the back of the dresser drawer. It wasn't much. It would never be much, but it was mine. And it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I also began to listen, really listen, to the staff who came and went, to the conversations that drifted through the halls. People talk more freely than they realize when they believe no one is paying attention. I heard of a woman who had found a way to contest her guardianship, of a man who had quietly regained control over his estate with the help of a lawyer who specialized in such things. I listened, and I took mental notes, and when I felt ready, I asked careful questions. Not too many, not enough to raise concern, just enough to learn what I needed to know. I wrote letters I didn't send. Pages and pages of words I poured onto paper in the dim light of early morning. When the building was still and the only sound was the soft hum of the heating vents, I wrote to Tom, to Adam, to the woman I had once been. I wrote out my grief, my anger, my regret, and then I folded those letters into neat squares and placed them in the tin with the money. I suppose I thought that if I ever found the courage to do what needed doing, I would leave them behind, as a kind of explanation. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was being unkind, if my silence was its own kind of cruelty. But then I would remember the look in the lawyer's eyes, the way he had slid those papers across the table as if I were already gone. I would remember the way Adam's voice sounded on the phone, brisk and distracted, more concerned with being efficient than with hearing me. And I would remind myself that this silence was not born of cruelty. It was born of survival. The staff noticed the change in me. I could see it in their glances, in the way they hesitated before entering my room, in the softness of their voices when they spoke to me. I was polite, always polite, but I no longer filled the air with chatter. I no longer volunteered stories of my past or asked about their day. I withdrew, piece by piece, into myself, and in that withdrawal, I found a strange kind of strength, the kind that comes when you stop trying to be seen and start seeing yourself again. I began to walk. Not far were the garden paths that wound through the residence grounds, the little stretch of sidewalk that led to the post box at the end of the drive. Each step felt like a reclamation, a reminder that I still had agency, however small. I would feel the ground beneath my feet, the air on my face, and I would think, this is mine, this moment is mine. I also found a lawyer, quietly, carefully, through a recommendation whispered by a nurse who had once seen her own mother in my position. The lawyer came not to the residence, but to a nearby cafe where I could meet him on my walks. We spoke in low voices, over cups of weak coffee, and slowly, he began to untangle the knot my life had become. He explained my rights, my options, the steps I could take. He really listened in a way no one else had in years, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I didn't rush, I took my time. I let the days pass, let the autumn give way to winter, let the silence settle around me like snow. I waited until I felt certain that I was no longer acting out of pain or pride, but out of necessity, out of a deep and abiding need to reclaim what little remained of my dignity, my autonomy, myself. And as I waited, I watched. I watched the way Adam's calls became even fewer, the way the family's visits dwindled to nothing. I watched the way my absence from their lives went unnoticed, unremarked upon, and I realized that in going silent, I had not been cruel. I had simply reflected back to them the distance they had already placed between us. There is a power in silence, a power in choosing when and how to speak again. And as I sat in my small room, with my hidden savings and my folded letters and my quiet plans, I felt that power grow. I knew the time would come when I would act, when my silence would end, not with words, but with deeds. And when that time came, I would be ready. Once I stepped fully into that silence, once I let it wrap around me like a cloak, something inside me began to shift. I moved differently after that. Not in big, sweeping gestures, no, that was never my way, but in small, deliberate steps that, over time, led me down a path I had not imagined I would ever take. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't announce my intentions or seek permission. I simply began to act as if my life still belonged to me, because it did. It always had, though I'd forgotten that for a while. The first change was so small. No one would have noticed unless they were looking closely. I stopped waiting. Waiting for calls, for visits, for the kindnesses that had grown so rare. I no longer checked the clock on Sundays. No longer watched the driveway for a car that never came. Instead, I turned my attention inward. I began to wake before dawn, while the world outside was still dark and quiet. I would sit by my window with a notebook, and I would write, not letters this time, not words for others, just thoughts, memories, hopes, faint as they were, a record of myself, so I wouldn't forget who I had been. The walks grew longer. I started to venture beyond the garden, beyond the grounds of the residence. There was a small park a few blocks away, with a bench beneath an old oak tree. I would walk there in the crisp morning air, sit for a while, and watch the world go by. Children with backpacks trudging to school, couples with their dogs, joggers with their headphones. No one noticed me, and that was a kind of freedom, to be invisible on my own terms. The lawyer, Michael was his name, continued to meet me at the cafe. We spoke quietly, carefully, over those weak coffees. He helped me untangle the legal web that had been spun around me. There were forms to file, letters to draft, steps to take that required patience and precision, and I followed them, one by one. I signed nothing without understanding it fully. I agreed to nothing that did not serve my own interest. Slowly, quietly, I began to regain control over my affairs. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough to remind myself that I was still here, that I still mattered. There was a small inheritance left to me by my aunt, money I had forgotten about, money that had been quietly sitting in an account untouched for years. Michael helped me access it. It wasn't much by the world's standards, but to me it felt like a fortune, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. Choice, a future I could shape, however modestly. With that money I found a place of my own, a small apartment, nothing grand, 2 rooms and a little balcony that overlooked a courtyard. But it was mine. The first space that had been mine alone since I was a young woman. The first space where I could decide what went where, what stayed, and what did not. I slowly filled it with a chair from a second-hand shop, a small table, and a few plants for the balcony. I chose soft colors, warm textures, things that made me feel at ease. I built a home, brick by invisible brick, out of the pieces of myself I had gathered back. Leaving the residence was quiet, too. No big farewell, no dramatic exit. I simply packed my few belongings, thanked the staff who had been kind to me, and walked out the door. I didn't tell Adam right away. I didn't feel the need. I didn't owe him that. He had made his choices, and now I was making mine. I lived simply in that apartment. I cooked my own meals, small, simple things, a pot of soup, a loaf of bread, and fresh fruit from the market. I found joy in the routines I made for myself, in the quiet of the mornings, in the sunlight that spilled across the floor, in the breeze that stirred the curtains. I wrote in my notebook still, but now the pages held more than grief. They held observations, small beauties I noticed each day, the way the light hit the buildings at dusk, the sound of rain on the balcony, the scent of bread from the bakery downstairs. I was learning, slowly, to be present with myself. I also began to reconnect in small ways with the world around me. I joined the library, something I hadn't done in years. I spent long afternoons lost in books, stories that reminded me of the vastness of life beyond my own small corner. I attended a community gardening group, tending a small patch of earth where I grew herbs and flowers, my hands in the soil. I felt grounded, connected, alive. I made acquaintances, not friends, not yet, but people who knew my name, who greeted me with genuine warmth. And that was enough. I moved differently in my mind as well. I stopped rehearsing the past, stopped turning over the same old wounds like stones in my hand. I began, instead, to imagine what could be. Not grand plans, not impossible dreams, just small hopes. A day spent in peace. A meal shared with someone kind. A morning when I woke and felt light instead of heavy. And in imagining these things, I began to find them. There were moments, of course, when the old sadness returned. When I thought of Adam, of the life I had given to him, of the ways he had turned away from me. When I thought of Tom, and how I wished he could have seen me in this new place, could have sat with me on that little balcony and shared a cup of tea. The ache was there, like a scar that twinges in the cold. But it no longer defined me. It no longer ruled my days. I never sought revenge. That was never in me. I didn't move differently to punish or to prove a point. I moved differently because I had to, because to stay as I was would have meant disappearing entirely, and I was not ready to disappear. Not yet. In time, word reached Adam. I don't know how. Perhaps through a letter forwarded from the residence. Perhaps through someone who saw me in the park or at the market. He called, his voice edged with confusion, with a hint of worry. I answered, calm and steady, and told him I was well, that I had found a place of my own, that I was happy, and I meant it. There was silence on the line, long and heavy, and then he said he was glad, that he hoped to visit soon. I told him he was welcome, and I meant that, too. I moved differently after that, and in doing so, I found my way back to myself. It wasn't immediate, that's what I want you to understand. When I stepped away, when I moved differently and let the silence settle between us, the world kept turning. At first, I don't think they noticed much at all. Adam went on with his routines, his plans, his tidy solutions to what he believed were problems that needed fixing. The grandchildren, now older, were busy with school and friends, and the busy work of growing up. My absence was just another empty chair at the table, another voice missing from the chorus of their lives. Life is noisy like that, it drowns out what's gone, at least for a time. But over the months, that absence began to shape the space around it, like a piece missing from a puzzle, like a light switched off in a familiar room. They didn't say it outright. I don't imagine they even admitted it to themselves, but I saw it, in the hesitations during our rare phone calls, in the way Adam's voice softened when he asked how I was, in the pauses that spoke more than words ever could. I watched from afar as the weight of what they had lost began to make itself known. It started small. The birthday they forgot was not mine this time, but one of their own, when I wasn't there to remind them, to send the card or make the call or bake the cake. The anniversary dinner that fell flat because I wasn't there, to set the table just so, to add the little touches that made it feel special. The holidays that felt hollow, the decorations put up in haste, the meals that lacked the warmth they once took for granted. I heard, through kind neighbors and old friends who still kept in touch, how my house didn't feel like home anymore. It had been sold, of course. The new owners live there now, but the family gatherings they tried to host in other places, rented halls or cramped dining rooms, never felt quite right. The space between them grew, not in miles, but in meaning. Without me there to hold it all together, the threads began to fray. There were practical things, too. The little tasks I had done without fuss, without thanks, simply because they needed doing, the keeping of dates, the managing of details, the quiet care that had smoothed the rough edges of their lives. They felt the absence of those things, though they wouldn't have named it as such. They felt it in missed appointments, in forgotten errands, in the small stresses that pile up when no one is tending to the background hum of daily life. And beyond the practical, there was the emotional weight, the anchor I had been, steady and sure, even when taken for granted. Without that anchor, they drifted. I could hear it in Adam's voice when he called, less certain, more strained. I could hear it in the way he spoke of the children, of his work, of his worries, as if he was looking for solid ground and couldn't quite find it. He didn't say it, not directly, but I knew. A mother knows that it wasn't about revenge. I need to say that again, because it's important. I didn't step away to punish them. I didn't watch their struggles with satisfaction. There was no triumph in it for me. Only a quiet, bittersweet clarity. I had been the glue in ways I hadn't even understood myself, until I stopped holding things together, and without that glue, the cracks became visible. They tried, in their way, to mend what was fraying. Adam spoke of visiting, of making time. There were offers to meet for coffee, to come by the apartment. But these gestures were tentative, unsure, and I, having found peace in my own company, in my own small routines, was careful. I didn't rush to fill the space between us. I let it remain, let it teach us both what it had to teach. The grandchildren began to write. Little notes at first, thank yous for a birthday card, updates on school, a drawing from the youngest. I kept each one, folded them neatly, tucked them into a drawer where I could take them out and hold them on quiet afternoons. They were tokens of connection, fragile but real. Signs that, perhaps, something was being rebuilt, slowly, on new ground. I watched, too, as Adam struggled with the weight of decisions he had once made. The house, the trust, the plans for my care, all the pieces he had arranged so neatly began to feel heavy in his hands. He never said as much, but the pride in his voice when he spoke of those plans faded. What had once been framed as responsibility began to sound, in his voice, like regret. I think what they lost without me wasn't just the comfort of my presence. It was the foundation I had quietly provided, the certainty that someone was there, steady and sure, holding the edges of their world in place. Without that, they had to face their own choices, their own shortcomings, without the soft landing I had always provided. And that was a hard thing for them, I think, harder than they expected. I saw it most clearly the Christmas after I left the residence. I spent it in my little apartment, with a small tree and a few candles, with simple food I had made myself. There was no rush, no noise, just peace. And as I sat by the window that evening, watching the snow fall, I thought of them, of the gatherings. That must have felt quieter, thinner, without the person who had always made sure the traditions were kept, the meals were warm, the laughter easy. I thought of them, and I hoped they were learning. Not out of spite, but out of love, because sometimes the only way people see what they've had is to feel its absence. I moved differently, and in doing so, I gave them the chance to move differently too. Whether they took that chance was theirs to decide. I could no longer carry that weight for them. And so I watched, from a distance, with a kind of quiet sorrow, but also with peace, because I knew I had done what I needed to do. I had stepped back not to harm, but to heal. Myself first, and perhaps, in time, them as well. It was a rainy afternoon when I wrote the letter. The kind of rain that comes steady and soft, not fierce or angry, but patient, as if it means to stay. I had been sitting by the window for hours, watching the droplets trace their paths down the glass, listening to the hush of water on the rooftops and sidewalks. The world felt wrapped in a blanket of gray, and within that quiet, I felt something stir, a need, deep and undeniable, to put words to all that had lived unspoken inside me for so long. I pulled out my notebook, the same one I had filled with my thoughts during those first hard months on my own, but this time, I turned to a fresh page, and I began to write, not for myself, but for Adam, for the son I had raised, the boy I had held in my arms, the man I had let go of when I stepped into my silence. I didn't plan the words, they came, as they wished, flowing from a place I had kept closed for fear of breaking open too wide to mend. I began by telling him about the day he was born, how small he was, how fierce his cry, how his tiny hand had wrapped around my finger with a strength that startled me. I wrote of the promises I made to him then, silent promises spoken only in the depths of my heart to protect him, to guide him, to love him beyond measure. I wrote of the nights I stayed awake by his crib, watching the rise and fall of his breath, marveling at the wonder of him. I wrote of the years that followed, of the joy and the worry, of the sacrifices that never felt like sacrifices because they were for him. The scraped knees I bandaged, the fears I soothed, the dreams I cheered on, the way I tried, always, to be a soft place for him to land, no matter how far he flew from me. I wrote of the pride I felt as I watched him grow, the pride that remained even as the distance between us grew. And then, gently, I wrote of the hurts, not to accuse, not to wound, but to name what had been left unspoken. I wrote of the moments I felt unseen, unheard, forgotten, of the small ways love had been taken for granted, the slow erosion of connection that had left me adrift. I wrote of the day he handed me that suitcase, of the way the car waited in the driveway, of the hollow ache that settled in my chest as I realized I was no longer part of his plans, only his responsibilities. But I also wrote of my own journey, of how stepping away had taught me to see myself again, of the strength I found in solitude, of the peace that had come not from being needed, but from needing nothing more than what I could give myself. I wrote of the small joys that filled my days, the sunlight on my balcony, the scent of rosemary in the breeze, the comfort of my own quiet company. I told him, in that letter, that I forgave him, not because he had asked for it, not because he deserved it more or less than anyone else, but because forgiveness was the gift I needed to give myself, because holding on to the weight of what had passed between us only kept me tethered to pain, and I was ready to be free. I wrote that I loved him still, as I always had, but that I loved myself too now, in a way I had forgotten was possible. When the letter was finished, I folded it carefully, my hands steady, my heart light. I placed it in an envelope, addressed it, and set it on the small table by the door. But as I sat in the fading light of that rainy afternoon, watching the world outside soften into evening, I knew I would not send it. That wasn't its purpose. The letter had done its work simply by being written. It had given voice to what had lived silent within me. It had released me from the grip of all I had carried. The next morning, I burned it. I took a small dish, carried it out onto the balcony, and with a single match, set the paper alight. I watched as the flames curled the edges, as the words turned to ash, as the smoke rose into the air and was carried away by the breeze. I felt no sadness, no regret, only relief, only peace. That letter was not for Adam, not really. It was for me, a way to say goodbye not to him, but to the version of myself who had waited so long to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, a way to mark the end of hoping for what could not be, and the beginning of simply being whole, enough, free. After that, something in me settled. I no longer measured my days against what had been lost, no longer traced the outlines of old wounds. I lived, fully, quietly, in each moment as it came. I let the past rest, I let the future be. And I stayed, firmly, in the now. Writing that letter changed me. Not because it changed Adam, or because it bridged the distance between us, but because it reminded me of my own voice, because it reminded me that my story was mine to tell, mine to release, mine to let go of when the time came. And it did come. On that gray rainy afternoon, it came, and I was ready. I still think of him, of course, of them all. Love doesn't vanish just because you've laid down the burden of longing. But I think of them with softness now, not with ache. I wish them well. I wish them peace. And I wish myself the same. The rain passed, as all storms do, and the sun returned. I stepped out onto the balcony the next morning, breathed in the clean, fresh air, and felt the warmth on my face. And I knew, in that moment, that I had let go of what no longer served me, that I had written the last word of that chapter, that I was free to begin the next dot. My life is quiet now. Not the heavy kind of quiet that comes from being silenced or overlooked, but the gentle kind that feels like a soft blanket at the end of a long day. The kind that fills a room without pressing on you, that leaves space for your thoughts to breathe. I didn't know, when all this began, that I would end up here in this small apartment, in this small life, but I am grateful for it. Grateful, in a way that's hard to explain unless you've been through the storm and come out on the other side with nothing but yourself, and found that to be more than enough. The mornings are my favorite now. I wake before the sun most days, when the world outside is still hushed and the first birds are just beginning their song. I always make my tea in the same chipped mug, the one I found at a thrift shop with a tiny blue flower painted on the side. I sit by the window, watching as the light changes, as the day begins to stir. There's something holy about those moments, something that reminds me that even the simplest parts of life can be beautiful if you're paying attention. I garden, on my little balcony, pots of herbs and flowers that I tend with care. There's a rosemary bush that's grown tall and sturdy, a basil plant that leans toward the sun, a cluster of marigolds that brighten the space with their cheerful orange faces. I talk to them sometimes, in the quiet way of someone who knows the power of listening. They ask for nothing but water and light, and in return they offer their small, steadfast presence. I find that comforting, a kind of companionship that asks nothing of me beyond what I can give. Most afternoons I take a walk. I follow no particular path, letting my feet lead me where they will through the park, past the shops, down quiet streets lined with trees. I nod to the people I see along the way, the ones I've come to recognize, the man who reads his paper on the same bench every day, the woman who walks her little dog with the pink collar, the children who race their bikes down the hill, their laughter echoing against the buildings. I am part of the world, in my small way, and that is enough. I still keep a journal, pages filled with the details of my days, with reflections, with memories that rise up unbidden and settle softly on the page. I write not because anyone will read it, but because it helps me see myself clearly. It helps me remember that I am here, that I am living, that I am whole in ways I didn't know I could be. Sometimes I write about Tom, about the life we shared, about the dreams we had. Sometimes I write about Adam, about the boy he was and the man he became, about the ways our paths diverged and the peace I've found in letting go of what might have been. There are still moments of sadness, of course. Grief doesn't leave you, it just changes shape. There are days when I hear a voice in the hallway that reminds me of Tom's, or see a father with his child and feel the ache of all that was lost. But those moments pass, like clouds across a bright sky. They do not stay, they do not define the day. Adam calls more often now. His voice is softer, less hurried. There is a tentative warmth in it, as if he is learning to speak to me all over again. We talked about simple things, the weather, the children, what he made for dinner. There are no grand apologies, no dramatic reconciliations, just small steps, small offerings, and that is enough. I do not need him to be different than he is. I only need to be true to myself, to stay steady in this new life I've built. He visited once, not long ago, brought the children, who are no longer small but still carry in their faces the echoes of the little ones they used to be. We sat on the balcony, shared tea and cake, talked about nothing and everything. It was quiet, and it was good. When they left, I felt no emptiness, no longing, only gratitude for the time we shared, and peace in the return to my solitude. I have learned that peace is not something you find in other people. It is not something they can give you or take away. It is something you build within yourself, moment by moment, choice by choice. I built mine from the ground up, with my own hands, from the rubble of what was broken. And it is stronger than I ever imagined it could be. I am not lonely. That surprises some people, I think. But loneliness is not about being alone. It is about feeling unseen, unheard, unvalued. I felt lonelier in the crowded rooms of my old life than I do in this quiet space I call home. Here, I see myself, I hear myself, and that is enough. My days are simple, and I cherish them. The smell of bread from the bakery downstairs, the sound of rain against the window, the warmth of the sun on my face, the gentle rhythm of my breath as I sit in stillness. These are the things that fill my life now. These are the things that matter. Sometimes I wonder what Tom would think if he could see me now. I like to believe he would be proud, that he would see the strength I found, the peace I made, the life I claimed as my own. I like to think he would sit beside me on this little balcony, take my hand, and say nothing at all because nothing would need to be said. I do not know what the future holds, none of us do. But I know that whatever comes, I will meet it with the quiet strength I have found in myself. I will meet it with grace, with gentleness, with the knowledge that I am enough, just as I am. And so I sit, in the soft light of evening, watching the shadows lengthen across the courtyard, listening to the murmur of the world outside. I am not angry. I am not waiting. I don't want to. I am finally empty, and that is beautiful.